There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a man when he's decided the rest of his life is going to be exactly like the part he's already lived. I know that silence. I lived inside it for 11 years, the way a snail lives inside its shell, not because it's warm in there, but because it's the only thing left that fits. What I'm about to tell you is the story of the morning that silence broke. Not with a shout, not with anything dramatic. It broke because a woman I'd never seen before came walking up my road in shoes that were never made for gravel, carrying a child's coat over her arm though there was no child with her, and asked me for work in a voice that had clearly practiced not sounding desperate. I almost said no. God forgive me, I almost said no. If you've ever been so tired of your own loneliness that you stopped noticing it, if you've ever mistaken numbness for peace, then stay with me. Because what happened over the next months on that dry stretch of Wyoming ground taught me something I thought I was too old and too broken to learn. And I promise you, before we're done, you'll understand why an old man still can't drive past a certain fence line without having to stop the truck and breathe. Let me start where it started, the morning she came. The coffee had gone cold in my hand before I noticed her. I was standing on the porch the way I stood every morning, not looking at anything in particular, just letting the day arrive without me. The bighorns were doing that thing they do in early light, going from black to blue to that bruised purple that never lasts long enough. My dog C was asleep against the door. Everything was where it always was. Everything had been where it always was for a very long time. Then there was a shape at the end of the road. We don't get walkers out here. The ranch sits 9 miles from the county road on a track most people wouldn't attempt without a truck built for it. So when I saw a figure moving up that long gravel stretch, slow and deliberate, I set my cup down on the rail and I watched. A man learns to watch, living alone. Not out of fear exactly, just out of the habit of being the only one responsible for whatever happens next. She came up out of the low ground and I could see she was a woman, and I could see even from that distance that she was struggling. Not stumbling, struggling. There's a difference. A stumble is your body failing. A struggle is your body arguing with your will and losing ground slowly. She walked like a woman who had told herself she would make it to my door and had decided that telling was the same as doing. I didn't go out to meet her. I'm not proud of that. I stood on my porch like some kind of judge and let her cover that last 100 yards alone, and I've thought about that a lot in the years since, about how the first thing I ever did for her was make her come the rest of the way by herself. When she got close I saw the shoes. City shoes, flat and thin, the kind of thing that would blister a foot to ribbons on this ground. I saw the coat over her arm, small, child-sized, worn at the cuffs. I saw a face that had been pretty once and was still handsome in the way a fence post is handsome after 40 winters, weathered down to the essential thing, everything soft worn off it. She was maybe 40. She could have been younger and just carrying more than her share. "Morning," she said. She stopped at the bottom of my steps and she did not sit down, though I could see she wanted to more than she wanted almost anything. "I'm sorry to come up on you like this." "Morning," I said. And then there was a silence, and in that silence I watched her gather herself. I watched her put the desperation back down in whatever place she kept it. I watched her lift her chin. "I heard in town you might be short a hand," she said. "I can work. I know I don't look it, but I can work, and I'll work for room and board and nothing else until you decide whether I'm worth more than that." Now, I want to be honest about the man I was that morning, because if I clean him up you won't believe the rest. My first feeling was not compassion. My first feeling was irritation. I liked my silence. I had built my silence carefully, board by board, over 11 years, and here was this stranger asking to come inside it. My second feeling was suspicion, because a woman doesn't walk 9 miles into nowhere to shovel manure unless the somewhere she came from was worse. And my third feeling, the one I'm ashamed of, was fear. Because she was looking at me like I might be the answer to something. And I had spent over a decade making very sure I would never again be the answer to anything for anyone. I don't take on hands I don't know, I said. I understand, but she didn't move. Ranch work is hard. It's not. I gestured at her, at the shoes, at all of it. It's not for everybody. I buried my husband in February and my daughter in March, she said. She said it flat. She said it the way you'd tell someone the time. And I understood that she'd learned to say it that way because saying it any other way would have cost her more than she had left to spend. There's nothing left for me to be afraid of, Mr. Calloway, I said. My mouth had gone dry. Then Calloway. There's nothing left for me to be afraid of, Mr. Calloway. So when you say it's hard, I believe you. But I've done hard. Hard isn't the thing that scares me anymore. She finally let herself look away from me, out toward the pens where the horses were shifting in the cool. The thing that scares me is stopping. So I'd rather you gave me the worst job you have than send me back down that road with nothing to walk toward. I have replayed that moment more times than I could count. I have wondered what would have happened to both of us if I'd said what I meant to say, which was no, which was I'm sorry for your losses, but this isn't a charity, which was go back to town. Instead, I heard myself say, you eaten. Something moved across her face. She got it back under control fast, but I saw it. Not since yesterday, she said. Come inside then. We'll talk about the rest after. That was the first thing. That was the whole beginning. A man too selfish to give up his silence, offering a plate of eggs because he couldn't quite make himself send a starving woman back down a 9-mile road. If you're waiting for the part where I become a good man, you'll wait a while. That morning, I was just a man who couldn't finish being a bad one. Her name was Della Hartwick. I learned it over eggs, and I learned the rest in pieces over the weeks that followed, because she was not a woman who told you things. She was a woman who let you find them out, which suited me fine, being the same kind of man. She ate like someone who was trying to remember table manners she hadn't needed in a while, slow, deliberate, ashamed of how much she wanted it. I made a second plate without asking and set it down in front of her, and went to stand at the window so she wouldn't have to be watched while she ate it. Small mercies. They were about all I had in stock. I'll be straight with you, I said to the window. I don't need a hand, not really. I run this place alone, and I've run it alone a long time. Behind me, her fork stopped. But I've got more work than one man ought to do and less sense than to admit it, I went on. There's a bunkhouse hasn't been used in years. It's dry and it's got a stove. You could stay there. There's fence needs walking, stock needs feeding, and the house. I stopped. The house. Rebecca's house. The house could use a hand it hasn't had in a while. I can do all of that. I imagine you can't yet, but I imagine you'll learn. I turned around. I can pay you a little, not much, more than nothing. And when you've saved enough to go wherever you're going, you go, and there's no hard feelings in it. She looked at me for a long moment. I'm not going anywhere, she said. There's nowhere left that I'm from. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, finish your eggs. Let me tell you about the ranch, because you can't understand what came after without understanding the ground it grew in. I'd had it 30 years. My wife Rebecca and I bought it young, when we were the kind of foolish that looks like courage from a distance. We were going to fill it up. That was the plan, unspoken, but understood the way the best plans are. Fill the house with children, fill the years with the small, ordinary noise of a family, grow old on this porch watching grandchildren chase the dog. We got 11 good years. We got no children. That door stayed closed for reasons the doctors gave names to and I never forgave. And then we got the diagnosis, and then we got 14 months, and then I got the silence. I want to be careful here, because grief makes liars of men, and I don't want to lie to you. I didn't fall apart when Rebecca died. That would have been the honest thing, and I couldn't manage honest. Instead, I did something worse. I got efficient. I got up every morning and I did the work, and I went to bed and I did it again, and I told anyone who asked that I was doing fine, and the terrible thing is that I almost believed it. I turned my whole life into a chore list because a chore list can't ask you how you're really doing. A chore list can't look at the empty side of the bed. A chore list just waits for you to check the next box, and I checked boxes for 11 years and called it living. The neighbors stopped coming by. First because I was grieving and they wanted to give me room, and then because I made it clear the room was permanent. The women from the church left casseroles on the porch that I ate alone and returned the dishes clean and empty, and never a word inside them. Slowly, the way water finds the low ground, everyone drained out of my life and left me exactly as alone as I decided I deserved to be. So when I tell you a stranger walked up my road and I let her stay, understand that I wasn't being kind. I've thought about it a long time and I don't think it was kindness at all. I think some part of me that I'd buried right alongside Rebecca sat up that morning and recognized something. Recognized a fellow traveler. Saw another person who'd been hollowed out by loss and was still walking around pretending to be solid and thought, there, that one. Let that one stay. Not kindness, recognition. There's a difference and it matters and we'll get to why. She was a disaster those first weeks. I'll give her that credit because she'd give it herself. She didn't know a thing about ranch work. She'd been a bookkeeper's wife in Denver, she told me eventually. A woman whose hardest daily labor had been the walk to the market and back. She'd never touched a horse. She was frightened of the cattle. She got the fencing pliers backward and pinched her hand so bad it bled, and she wrapped it in a rag and kept working and didn't mention it. And I only found out because I saw the blood on the wire the next morning. But here's the thing about Della Hartwick that took me an embarrassingly long time to understand. She never stopped. I'd give her a job I was sure would defeat her, half hopping it would, half ashamed of the hope. And she'd stand there looking at it with her jaw set in that particular way, and then she'd start, and she'd do it wrong, and she'd do it wrong again, and then somewhere around the fourth or fifth try she'd do it right, and she'd never do it wrong again after that. She learned like a woman paying off a debt. Every skill she took like it was owed to her and she meant to collect. One evening about 3 weeks in, I came up from the south pasture and found her standing in the corral with the mare. Now, that mare was a mean-tempered animal that I'd half given up on, a horse that bit and kicked and had put me on the ground more than once. And there was Della, standing perfectly still in the middle of the pen, her hand held out flat, not moving, just waiting. And the mare had its nose in her palm. "How long have you been standing there?" I asked. "An hour, maybe." She didn't turn around. She came over on her own. I didn't do anything. I just stopped needing her to. I leaned on the fence and watched the two of them, the broken woman and the mean horse, standing in the last of the light like they'd worked something out that the rest of us weren't privy to. "You've got away with her," I said. "No." Della finally lowered her hand and stepped back, easy, no sudden movements. "I just understand her is all. She's not mean. She's just been handled by people who wanted things from her." She came to the fence and stood beside me. Once she figured out I didn't want anything, she stopped bracing for it. I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other sentence anyone has ever said to me. Once she figured out I didn't want anything, she stopped bracing for it. I looked at Della Hartwick standing beside me in the dusk, this woman who'd walked out of the worst year of her life and into the middle of mine, and I understood for the first time that she wasn't just talking about the horse. The nights were the hardest. I know they were hardest for her because they were hardest for me, and we were, in that one particular way, the same animal. I'd see her light on in the bunkhouse long after a person who'd worked as hard as she should have been asleep. Just burning there in the dark, a small yellow square against all that black country. And I'd stand at my own window with my own light off and I'd watch it, the way you'd watch a fire on a far ridge, wondering what it meant and whether you ought to do something about it. One night I couldn't stand it. I don't know why that night and not another. I put on my boots and I walked out across the yard and I knocked on the bunkhouse door, and when she opened it I saw she'd been crying, and I saw her decide not to hide it, which took more courage than hiding it would have. "I saw your light," I said, which was a stupid thing to say and we both knew it. "I can't sleep." She stepped back to let me in. I could never sleep after. I'd lie there and my body would be so tired and my mind just, she made a gesture, a small helpless circling of her hand. It just keeps going back, to the room, to the last day. I keep thinking if I go over it enough times I'll find the place where I could have done something different. I sat down at her little table. There was a photograph propped against the lamp. A girl, maybe 6, gap-toothed, laughing at whoever held the camera. That her. Della sat down across from me. Emma, she was 6. It came on fast. The doctors said sometimes it does with the fever kind. 3 days. She was fine on a Sunday and by Wednesday she stopped, started again. And Tom, my husband, he couldn't, after Emma, he just couldn't. He wasn't a strong man. I loved him, but he wasn't strong, and losing her broke something in him that didn't grow back. And one morning in February I found him in the garage and the car was running and she didn't finish. She didn't have to. I sat there in that little bunkhouse with the photograph of a laughing dead girl between us and I understood that this woman had lost more in 2 months than most people lose in a lifetime, and that she had walked 9 miles up a gravel road afterward and asked a stranger for the hardest work he had, and that the asking had been the bravest thing I'd ever seen a human being do. "I don't know how you're still standing," I said. It came out rougher than I meant. "I'm not sure I am." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, unashamed now. "Some days I think I'm just a habit my body hasn't broken yet." She looked at me. "Why did you let me stay, Mr. Calloway? You didn't need a hand. I knew it that first morning. I could see it. So why?" And I should have deflected. That's what I'd have done with anyone else. But it was late, and there was a dead child looking up at me from the table, and I was so tired of being a man who deflected. "My wife died," I said, 11 years ago, and I stopped. I searched for it. I stopped being a person after. I kept doing the things a person does, but I stopped being one. And I told myself that was fine, that was what I wanted, that I'd had my share of living and the rest was just running out the clock. I looked at the photograph. And then you came up my road looking like exactly how I felt inside, and I couldn't send you away. Because sending you away would have been like, my voice did something I didn't expect. It would have been like admitting there was no help for either of us, and I guess some stubborn part of me wasn't ready to admit that, even after 11 years. Della was quiet for a long time. "So we're 2 people who don't know how to be alive," she said finally, "trying to run a cattle ranch. And here is the thing I want you to understand, the thing that surprised me so much that I've never gotten over it." She smiled when she said it. It was small, and it was tired, and it was mostly held together with grief. But it was a smile. The first one I'd seen from her. And I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in so long. I didn't have a name for it anymore. I felt the silence crack. That was the spring. I've gone on longer than I meant to, but you have to understand the beginning to understand what it cost us both. Later, when everything I'd started to hope for came up against the thing that was waiting down the road for both of us. Because here's what I didn't tell you. Here's what I didn't know yet, that morning on the porch. Della Hartwick hadn't just been running from grief when she walked up my road. She'd been running from something else too. Something that was going to come looking for her. Something that would make me choose before the year was out. Between the silence, I'd finally started to let go of, and her. But that's the second part of the story, and I'll need to gather myself before I tell it. The letter came in June. I want to back up a little before I get to it, because the weeks between that night in the bunkhouse and the day that letter arrived were the best weeks I'd had in 11 years. And I've learned that you have to hold the good part up to the light before you tell about the bad part, or else people think the whole thing was tragedy. It wasn't. That's what I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. It wasn't a tragedy. It was the best thing that ever happened to a man who thought nothing was ever going to happen to him again. Della changed the ranch. She changed it the way spring changes a hillside, slow, and then all at once, so that you can't say exactly when the brown became green, but one morning you look up and the whole thing has turned. She started with the house. I hadn't touched Rebecca's things in 11 years. The sewing basket still sat by the chair where she'd left it. Her coat still hung by the door. I'd built my whole silence around not moving those things, and I'd have told you I never would. But one afternoon I came in from the fields and found Della standing in the front room holding Rebecca's coat, and I felt the old anger come up hot and fast, and then I saw that she wasn't moving it. She was just holding it. Standing there with her face in the collar, breathing it in. She had good taste, Della said without turning around. This is a beautiful coat. She hung it back exactly where it had been, exactly. You can tell a lot about a woman from a coat like this. She wasn't showy, but she knew quality when she found it. She smoothed the shoulder of it and stepped back. I won't move anything of hers, I want you to know that. I'll clean around them till the end of time before I move a single thing. They're not in my way, they're just her still being here. And I understand that better than most. I stood in the doorway and I couldn't speak. Because for 11 years I'd thought I was the only person in the world who understood why that coat couldn't move. And here was a stranger who'd understood it in an afternoon. After that, something loosened between us. She cleaned the house, but she cleaned it like a caretaker of a shrine, tender with every object, and slowly the house stopped being a mausoleum and started being a home again. She opened windows that hadn't been opened in a decade. She found Rebecca's good dishes and washed them, and we ate off them. And the first time I saw my supper on Rebecca's blue-rimmed plate, I had to go outside for a minute. And Della let me go and didn't say a word about it when I came back. We fell into a rhythm. I taught her the work and she taught me. I didn't even notice it happening. She taught me how to be a person again. It was in the small things. She'd ask me a question at supper and actually wait for the answer. She'd laugh at something, and the sound of it in that quiet house was like water in a dry year. She started keeping a little garden by the bunkhouse, and she'd bring things up to the house, and I got used to the sight of her coming across the yard in the evening with her hands full of green. One night she asked me to tell her about Rebecca, just like that. "Tell me about her," she said. "I'd like to know who I'm keeping house for." And I did. For the first time in 11 years, I talked about my wife. I told her about the way Rebecca sang off-key on purpose to make me laugh, and how she cried at cattle auctions because she got attached, and how she'd wanted children so bad it was a physical ache in her, and how we never got them, and how she'd made her peace with it in a way I never could. I talked until the fire burned down, and Della listened the way she did everything, completely, with her whole self, holding nothing back. "Thank you," she said when I finally stopped, "for giving her to me. Now she's not just a coat by the door, now she's a person I know." I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and realized I'd laughed 3 times that day. And I lay there and I did something I hadn't done since Rebecca died. I let myself hope. That was my mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe hope is never a mistake even when it costs you. I still don't know. I'm an old man now and I still don't know. The letter was addressed to Della Hartwick, C.O. Calloway Ranch, which meant somebody knew exactly where she was. I brought it up from the box with the rest of the mail, and I watched her face when she saw the return address, and I watched all the color go out of it. "Della, it's nothing." She folded it in half without opening it and put it in her apron pocket. "It's nothing. I'll deal with it later." But she didn't come up to the house for supper that night, and her light burned in the bunkhouse until dawn. The next morning she was different, brittle. She worked harder than ever, which I'd learned was how she ran from things, and when I tried to talk to her, she gave me answers with the doors closed behind them. It went on like that for 3 days, and on the 3rd night I couldn't stand it, same as before, and I walked out across the yard and knocked on her door. She'd been crying again, but this was different from the grief crying I'd seen before. This was afraid. "You have to tell me," I said, "whatever it is, because 3 days ago we were." I didn't have the word for what we were. "And now you're walling yourself off, and I've spent 11 years behind a wall, Della. I know what it looks like from the outside. So tell me what's on the other side of it." She sat down at the little table. The photograph of Emma was still there. She looked at it for a long moment and then she told me. Her husband Tom, the one who died in the garage in February, hadn't been the gentle failed man I'd pictured. Or he had been, but he'd also been in debt. Deep, ugly debt to people who didn't take death as a reason to stop collecting. He'd borrowed against everything, including things that weren't his to borrow against, from a man named Royce Deller who ran a good deal of Denver from behind a legitimate front. When Tom died, the debt didn't die with him. It transferred, the way these things do among men without souls, to the only Hartwick left standing. That's why I ran, she said. I didn't come here just for grief. I came here because Deller's people came to the house after the funerals and told me what I owed and what they'd do if I didn't pay it. And I had nothing, I had nothing. I'd buried my whole family and I had nothing left to give them but myself. And I understood what that meant, what they meant. And I put everything I could carry in a bag and I ran. She was gripping the edge of the table. I ran as far as the bus would take me and then I walked. And I thought maybe out here this far from anywhere they'd never. She pushed the letter across the table to me. But they found me. They always find you. He found me. I read the letter. I'm not going to tell you everything it said. Some of it I've spent years trying to forget. But the shape of it was this. Royce Deller knew where she was, he knew who I was, he knew what I had, and he was giving her 30 days to come back to Denver and settle her husband's debt in whatever manner he saw fit, or he would come to the ranch and settle it himself. And he made it clear, in the flat, courteous way that kind of evil always uses, that settling it himself would not be limited to Della. I set the letter down. My hands, I noticed, were very steady. They're always steady when it matters. It's the only useful thing I ever inherited from my father. You should have told me the first day, I said. So you could throw me out. So you could send me back down that road knowing what was waiting for me. Her voice broke. I couldn't. I know that was wrong. I know I brought this to your door. But I'd been dead inside for so long and then I got here and I started to feel like a person again, like maybe there was still a reason to, and I was selfish. I let myself have it. I let myself have these weeks, this place. And I knew the whole time it was borrowed and I didn't care. I'm sorry. I'll leave in the morning. I'll go back and I'll settle it. That's the only way this ends without you getting hurt. No, I said. Then. No, I stood up. You're not going anywhere and you're not settling anything with that man. You don't understand what he is. I understand exactly what he is. And I did. I'd known men like Royce Deller my whole life in different clothes. Men who mistake other people's fear for their own strength. Della, look at me. Look at me. I've had 11 years to think about what my life is worth, and I'll tell you what I decided. I decided it wasn't worth much. I decided I was just running out the clock. And a man who's decided that about himself is not a man you want coming after the people he cares about, because he's got nothing to lose and he knows it. I picked up the letter and folded it and put it in my own pocket. 30 days. All right. Then we've got 30 days. To do what? To make sure that when he comes, and he'll come, men like that always come, he doesn't find what he's expecting. I want to be careful how I tell this next part, because I've heard men tell stories like this before and make themselves into heroes, and I wasn't a hero. I was a scared man in his 60s with a bad knee and an old rifle, and I was terrified the entire time, and if you'd seen inside me, you'd have seen nothing but fear. Courage isn't the absence of fear. I learned that in those 30 days. Courage is just fear that's decided somebody else matters more than itself. The first thing I did was the hardest thing. I drove into town, to the neighbors I'd spent 11 years pushing away, and I knocked on doors I'd let close, and I asked for help. You'd have every right to expect them to turn me away. God knows I'd earned it. 11 years of returned casserole dishes and unanswered waves. But here's a thing about people that I'd forgotten in my long silence, a thing Della gave back to me just by making me go ask. People are mostly better than we let ourselves believe. I stood on Hank Sorensen's porch, Hank, whose wife's funeral I hadn't gone to, whose Christmas invitations I'd ignored for a decade, and I told him I was in trouble and I needed help, and that old man looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "Well, about damn time you came down off that hill then." And he put on his coat. By the end of that week I had 8 men. Ranchers mostly. Men who understood land and property and the difference between the law as it's written and the law as it lives out here where the county sheriff is an hour away on his best day. Men who'd known Rebecca, who'd watched me disappear after she died, who, it turned out, had never stopped leaving the door open even after I stopped knocking. We didn't do anything illegal. I want that on the record. We did something older than legal. We made it known, through the channels such things travel, that the Calloway Ranch was not an isolated woman alone on 9 miles of gravel. We made it known that it was watched, that it was defended, that any man who came up that road with harm in mind would find more than he'd bargained for. And Della, who I'd expected to fall apart, who had every reason in the world to fall apart, Della did the opposite. Something came alive in her during those 30 days. She'd spent months as prey, running, and now for the first time she got to stand still and be defended, and I watched it change her. She stopped flinching at sounds. She started sleeping. One evening I found her cleaning my old rifle at the kitchen table, competent and calm, and when I raised an eyebrow she said, "Tom taught me." It's about the only useful thing he ever taught me, and she almost smiled. But I could see the fear underneath it. Both our fears sitting at the same table. He came on the 29th day. Not the 30th, the 29th. Men like that always come a day early because the cruelty is the point, because they want to catch you before you're ready. But we were ready. We'd been ready for a week. 3 vehicles came up the road in the late afternoon, and C started barking, and I stepped out onto the porch with the rifle held down along my leg, not raised, just held, and Della came and stood beside me, and I said, "Get inside," and she said, "No," and I understood there was no arguing it, and in a strange way I was glad. If we were going to face it, we'd face it standing next to each other. Royce Deller got out of the middle car. He was smaller than I'd pictured. They always are. A neat man in a good coat, with the dead eyes of someone who'd stopped seeing other people as real a long time ago. He had 4 men with him. He looked at me, and he looked at Della, and he smiled like we were all old friends. "Mrs. Hartwick," he said, "you've led me quite a way." And then he stopped, because Hank Sorensen stepped out from the barn, and Del Ramirez stepped off the porch of the bunkhouse, and the Kessler brothers came around from the equipment shed, and Tom Whitlow stood up from where he'd been sitting against the water tank, and one by one, out of the buildings and the shadows, 8 men who'd known this land their whole lives made themselves visible. Not doing anything, not threatening, just being there, just being present in a way that made the math very clear. I watched Deller do the arithmetic. I watched him understand that he'd driven 9 miles up a gravel road expecting to find a frightened woman and a broken-down old man, and had instead found a community that had decided, this once, this one time, to stand. "This isn't your debt, old man," he said to me. His voice had changed. The smoothness had gone thin. "It's not hers either," I said. "It's a dead man's, and dead men don't pay. You want to keep chasing money a corpse owes you, that's your business. But you'll chase it somewhere that isn't my land. And you'll do it knowing that every rancher in this county now knows your name and your face and your license plates." I let that sit. "We're a long way from the law out here, Mr. Deller. That cuts more than one way. You might want to think about which way it cuts for a man who's a long way from home and outnumbered 8 to 1. I'd like to tell you there was more to it. A confrontation, a struggle, some dramatic reckoning. There wasn't. That's not how these things really end. Evil is mostly cowardice in a good coat, and cowardice does math faster than anything else on earth." Deller stood there a moment longer, and I watched him decide that Della Hartwick's dead husband's debt was not worth what it was going to cost him to collect it here, in front of witnesses, from men who weren't afraid of him. "She's not worth this," he said finally to me, and it was meant to be a threat, but it came out almost like a question. "You're right," I said. "She's worth a great deal more. That's the part you never understood." He got in his car. They all got in their cars. And they drove back down that 9-mile road, and we stood in the yard and watched the dust of them until it settled, and none of us said anything for a long time. It was Hank who finally broke it. He came up and put his hand on my shoulder, the first person to touch me with any kindness in longer than I could remember, and he said, "Rebecca would be glad you came down off that hill then." And then all 8 of them, one by one, shook my hand and got in their trucks and left me alone with Della in the falling dark. I'd like to tell you she stayed forever, that we married and grew old together, and the whole thing wrapped up neat as a Sunday. It wasn't quite like that. Life isn't quite like that, and I promised you I wouldn't lie. Della stayed through the summer and into the fall, and somewhere in there, the arrangement stopped being about work and wages and became about 2 people who'd found each other at the bottom of their separate griefs and climbed out together. I won't tell you exactly when it changed. Some things a man keeps, but I'll tell you that the bunkhouse lights stopped burning at night, and I'll let you understand that however you understand it. But she carried something I couldn't fix, the grief for Emma, for the little girl in the photograph, that didn't leave her and it wasn't supposed to. There were days it took her all the way under, days she couldn't get out of bed, days she'd stand at the fence line looking at nothing with her arms wrapped around herself. And I learned to just stand next to her on those days. Not fix it. Just stand there, the way she taught the mare that not everyone who comes close wants something from you. "Do you think it gets better?" she asked me once on one of the bad days. "Really, not the thing people say, the truth." And I thought about Rebecca, 11 years gone, and the coat still by the door. "No," I said, "I don't think it gets better, I think it gets carried. You get stronger around it. The weight doesn't change, but your back does." I put my arm around her, and it helps to have somebody carry the other side. She leaned into me. "Is that what we're doing?" "I think it might be." I'm an old man now, telling this from a porch that isn't as quiet as it used to be. Della's in the garden. She's got the whole south side in vegetables now, more than 2 people could ever eat, so we give it away, which has a way of bringing the neighbors around. The mare lived to be old and mean and died in her sleep, which is more than most of us can hope for. Rebecca's coat still hangs by the door. Della never moved it. She hangs her own beside it every evening. And I've come to understand that as a kind of grace I don't have words for, the way the 2 of them, the living woman and the dead one, share the same peg without any jealousy in it, because Della never once asked me to love Rebecca less to love her more. She just asked me to love, and it turned out I had more of it in me than 11 years of silence had let me believe. I don't drive past the county road fence line without stopping the truck. I told you that at the start, and I'll tell you again now that you know why. It's the place where I first saw her that morning, a shape coming up out of the low ground in shoes that were never meant for gravel. And every time I stop there, I think about the man I almost was, the one who almost said no, who almost sent her back down that road, who almost chose his safe gray silence over the terrifying gift of one more chance to matter to somebody. I came so close to saying no. That's the thing I can't get past even now. That's the thing that stops the truck, how close I came, how a whole life, hers and mine both, hung on a tired old man's willingness to say 4 words instead of 1. "Come inside then, we'll talk," instead of no. If you take one thing from an old man's story, take that. Somebody is going to come up your road someday, worn down to the essential thing, asking for less than they need and afraid you'll give them nothing. And you'll want to say no. You'll have 100 good reasons. Your silence, your safety, the careful walls you've built. Say the other thing. Say, "Come inside." You have no idea, you cannot possibly have any idea, what you might be saving, including, if you're lucky, and God knows I was luckier than I ever deserved to be, including yourself.